The Dragon Empress had ruled the ashen skies for 7 centuries, her word shaping continents and her fire ending wars before they began. Yet nothing in her long memory prepared her for the moment her albino hatchlings turned away from her outstretched claws and chose a human child instead. The hatchlings were rare beyond value, their pale scales like moonstone, eyes glowing with soft silver light that marked them as omens of balance rather than destruction. And from the moment they hatched, the Empress had guarded them with a devotion that bordered on obsession. No other dragon was permitted near without her consent. No servant lingered too long, and no creature of another race was allowed within sight of the nursery cavern carved into the heart of the volcanic mountain she called home. Dragons respected her authority, feared her wrath, and trusted her instincts, until the day the mountain trembled not with fire, but with confusion. It began with a human caravan that had lost its way through the high passes, driven off course by unnatural storms that even dragons had failed to predict. Among them was a child named Elian, no more than 10 winters old, slight of frame and quiet by nature, carried along by fate rather than ambition. When the caravan was scattered by falling rock and roaring winds, Elian was separated, tumbling down a hidden ravine that should have ended his life. Instead, he landed within a forgotten tunnel warmed by the mountain's breath, crawling forward in pain and fear until exhaustion claimed him. By the time he awoke, he was surrounded by soft light and warmth, not the burning heat of dragon fire, but something gentler, alive. The albino hatchlings had found him first, drawn by instinct older than reason, their small bodies pressing close to the shivering human child, their pale scales absorbing his fear like stone absorbs sunlight. Elian did not scream. He did not run. He simply curled inward, sharing what little warmth he had, whispering nonsense words meant to comfort himself more than anything else. When the Empress arrived, alerted by the strange stillness of her offspring rather than alarm, she expected to find ashes or blood. Instead, she found her hatchlings asleep, wrapped around a human child like living shields, their tiny wings draped protectively over his shoulders. Rage ignited instantly, a fury capable of collapsing the mountain itself, and the cavern filled with firelight as she roared, demanding to know who had brought a human into her domain. The hatchlings stirred, but they did not flee to her. They tightened their hold on Elian, emitting distressed chirps that echoed painfully through the Empress's mind, a sound no dragon mother could ignore. Shock cut deeper than any blade. She stepped closer, expecting them to scatter at her presence, but instead one hatchling lifted its head and placed itself between her and the child, a gesture of defiance so unthinkable that the watching dragon guards froze where they stood. The Empress felt something crack inside her. Not anger, but disbelief. She reached out gently, suppressing her aura, and spoke in the ancient tongue meant to calm and command. Yet the hatchlings refused her call, their silver eyes fixed on the human child who stirred at the sound of her voice. Elian awoke slowly, blinking against the glow of molten stone and towering scales, his breath hitching as he realized where he was. But even then he did not scream. He felt the hatchlings shift anxiously and, without understanding why, raised a trembling hand to soothe them, brushing pale scales with careful fingers. The Empress watched in stunned silence as her children responded instantly, tension melting from their small bodies as they leaned into the human's touch, a bond forming before her eyes that defied dragon law, instinct, and pride. No chains were broken, no spells cast, yet something far older than force had asserted itself, the choice of the young. In that moment, the Empress realized with chilling clarity that her authority, absolute as it was, did not extend into the hearts of her hatchlings, and that the human child before her had become something far more dangerous than an enemy. He had become trusted. The mountain did not burn that day, but something far more unsettling began to grow in its depths. A future the Empress could not command, only witness. The shock did not fade when the first heartbeat passed, nor when the cavern settled back into uneasy silence, because for the Dragon Empress, disbelief was more dangerous than rage, and it crept through her thoughts like ice spreading across molten stone. She ordered the guards back with a single flick of her wing, not out of mercy toward the human child, but because she needed the space to understand what she was seeing without the weight of witnesses turning uncertainty into weakness. The hatchlings remained coiled around Elian, their pale bodies forming a living barrier, silver eyes tracking every movement the Empress made, and that alone shook her more deeply than any rebellion ever had. Dragons were born knowing hierarchy the way fire knew how to burn. Hatchlings clung to power, to presence, to the certainty of the strongest will in the chamber. And yet here they were, choosing stillness over dominance, warmth over command. The Empress circled slowly, suppressing her aura until the air no longer shimmered with heat, and studied the human child as a ruler would study a rival. Carefully, analytically, searching for hidden weapons. Elian possessed none. His clothes were torn, his hands scraped raw, his breathing uneven from fear held barely in check. Yet his posture was open, instinctively protective rather than possessive. His arm resting loosely around one hatchling's neck as if he feared hurting it more than himself. The Empress probed deeper, brushing his mind with dragon sense, expecting deceit or ambition, and found only exhaustion, concern for the strange creatures that had kept him warm, and a quiet acceptance of whatever came next. It was profoundly unsettling. Dragon law dictated that any non-dragon found within a royal nesting chamber be incinerated without exception. But law was built on precedent, and precedent had never accounted for hatchlings who refused their mother's call. She spoke to them again, softly this time, abandoning command for reassurance, telling them they were safe, that she was there, that the human would not harm them. The hatchlings answered not with obedience, but with emotion. Images and sensations pressed into her mind. Cold stone, fear, hunger, and then sudden warmth, steady breath, a heartbeat not fueled by fire but constancy. They showed her how Elian had woken to find them shivering and had shared his cloak without hesitation. How he had spoken gently even as terror clenched his chest. How his fear had never turned into threat. The Empress recoiled, not from the truth of it, but from the implication. To dragonkind, humans were clever, dangerous, and fleeting, creatures whose ambitions burned fast and consumed everything around them. Yet her own children had seen something else entirely. When the dragon court was summoned, the mountain filled with ancient voices and restrained fury, elders demanding blood, accusing the Empress of weakness for allowing a human to live. Elian was brought before them still flanked by the hatchlings, who hissed and flared defensively when any dragon stepped too close, their pale fire igniting in warning. The Empress stood between the court and the child, her authority barely holding the line as she declared that no judgment would be passed until the hatchlings themselves were heard. Outrage followed. Hatchlings were not arbiters of law, but the Empress did not yield, because to do so would have meant denying what she had already witnessed. She allowed the court to feel the bond, opening her mind and sharing the memories given to her, forcing ancient dragons to experience the moment fear became trust through human hands. Silence fell heavy and reluctant, and though many remained unconvinced, none could deny the reality before them. Elian did not plead for his life. He only asked, in a small, steady voice, that the dragons not hurt the hatchlings because of him. That single request landed harder than any argument because it revealed the core of the bond. He did not see himself as chosen or special, only responsible. The Empress realized then that whatever decision she made would echo beyond her reign, because the future of her children had already stepped outside the boundaries of tradition, and it wore a human face. The Dragon Court did not dissolve in agreement, but in something far more dangerous to ancient power, doubt, and as the elders withdrew into heated, private deliberation, the Empress remained in the cavern with Elian and the hatchlings, the weight of centuries pressing down on her in a way no battlefield ever had. She ordered the human child given food and clean water, not as a concession but as a necessity, and watched closely as Elian accepted both with quiet gratitude, breaking small pieces to share with the hatchlings before touching any himself. The gesture was simple, almost thoughtless, yet it lodged itself in the Empress's mind like a splinter, because it mirrored a dragon value so old it predated crowns, the protection of the young above the self. She tested boundaries carefully, allowing a servant to approach, then another, observing how the hatchlings reacted, noting that their tension eased only when Elian remained within sight, his presence anchoring them in a way even her own aura could not. Reluctantly, she began to understand that this bond was not a rejection of her, but an expansion of safety beyond what dragonkind had ever allowed. When the elders returned, Their verdict was fractured, split between those who demanded Elian's death to preserve tradition and those who feared the consequences of harming something the hatchlings had claimed. The Empress listened to every argument, then did something unprecedented. She spoke not as ruler, but as mother. She declared that her children's survival, emotional as well as physical, outweighed any law written by dragons who no longer remembered what it meant to be small and vulnerable. She announced that Elian would remain under her protection, not as a captive, not as a servant, but as a guest bound by oath to harm no dragon and to leave when the hatchlings no longer needed him. Outrage flared, threats of secession whispered through the court. But the Empress did not bend, because she had seen what force could not accomplish. Over the following weeks, the mountain changed in subtle ways. The hatchlings grew stronger, their pale scales brightening, their fire stabilizing rather than flaring wildly, and Elian became a constant presence, reading to them from weathered caravan books, humming tuneless songs, and sitting quietly when words failed. Dragons observed from a distance, fascinated and disturbed as they watched their future rulers respond to patience instead of dominance, curiosity instead of fear. Elian learned dragon customs slowly, carefully, always deferring, always aware that one misstep could cost him everything. Yet the hatchlings never left his side, sleeping curled against him even when the Empress herself rested nearby. The realization settled heavily over the court that this human child was not weakening the next generation, but tempering it. Where dragons once learned control through pain and hierarchy, these hatchlings learned it through trust, and the implications were terrifying. The Empress felt the shift too, the quiet rebalancing of power that did not threaten her throne but redefined its purpose. She began to envision a future where dragons ruled not through fear alone, but through restraint understood rather than imposed. Still, doubt lingered, because peace built on something so fragile as trust could shatter easily. When news reached the mountain that human kingdoms had learned of the albino hatchlings and were mobilizing forces in hopes of capture or leverage, the Empress watched Elian carefully, searching for fear or betrayal, and found neither, only resolve. The child did not ask to leave or to warn his people. He only asked how he could help protect the hatchlings. In that moment, the Empress understood fully that the bond formed in her cavern was no accident, no aberration, but a convergence of needs across species, and that the greatest threat ahead would not come from a human's ambition, but from dragons unwilling to accept that the future had chosen a different path. The reckoning came not with fire, but with silence, as human armies gathered at the edges of dragon territory and waited, unsure whether fear or greed should make the first move. And the Dragon Empress realized that the world beyond her mountain had already begun to test the future her hatchlings represented. She summoned envoys from the human kingdoms, not to threaten, but to witness, allowing them to enter the lower caverns under strict guard, where they saw with their own eyes the albino hatchlings resting peacefully beside a human child who bore no chains and showed no signs of coercion. Murmurs spread through the delegations as fear clashed with disbelief, and when questioned, Elian spoke simply, telling them he was there because the hatchlings had chosen him, and that he would leave if they asked him to, but not before. The honesty of his words unsettled both sides more than any show of power could have. The Empress stood before all of them and declared that any attempt to seize the hatchlings would be met with annihilation, but she also declared something unprecedented, that humans would not be punished for curiosity or fear alone, only for violence. This line, thin and dangerous, held. Over time, the armies withdrew, not because they were defeated, but because the story that spread back to their capitals was impossible to twist into justification for war. Years passed, and the albino hatchlings grew into sleek, radiant dragons whose presence calmed rather than dominated, whose silver fire healed as readily as it burned, and who remembered the human child who had shared warmth with them when the world was cold. Elian aged among them, never elevated to ruler, never reduced to symbol, but trusted, and when the time came for him to return to human lands, it was not exile but graduation. The Empress watched him leave with a strange ache she would never name, knowing that her children no longer needed him, yet would never forget him. Under their influence, dragonkind shifted slowly but irrevocably, power tempered by understanding, fear balanced by choice. And in the end, when historians searched for the moment the Age of Terror ended and the Age of Balance began, they would not find a battle or a treaty, only a single quiet truth, that even an empress cannot command the hearts of the young, and that sometimes the future chooses a human child simply because he chose kindness first. The legacy of that choice did not crystallize immediately, because history rarely announces its turning points while they are still breathing, but decades later the world would look back and realize that the age of domination had ended the moment the albino hatchlings learned to choose rather than obey. As the Empress's reign drew toward its natural twilight, her silver-scaled children had become living bridges between fire and flesh, moving freely between dragon eyries and human cities, not as weapons or curiosities but as guardians whose presence cooled tempers before blades were ever drawn. Elian, grown now into a quiet, steady man, never claimed authorship of the change, yet everywhere he traveled people recognized something different in him. Not power, but a gravity born of having been trusted by beings who could have burned the world and chose not to. When disputes flared between kingdoms and dragon clans, it was often Elian who was asked to stand between them, not to negotiate terms, but to remind both sides of the cost of forgetting their own young. He spoke rarely of the mountain, but when he did, he spoke of warmth shared without promise, of fear answered without cruelty, and those words carried more weight than threats ever had. The Dragon Empress watched all of this from her high throne, pride and melancholy intertwined, understanding at last that her greatest act of rule had not been conquest or preservation of law, but restraint in the face of wounded instinct. When she finally yielded her crown, passing authority to one of the albino dragons who had once curled protectively around a human child, the ceremony was attended by both dragonkind and humans alike, standing together beneath open sky, no longer divided by terror. In her final years, the Empress would sometimes gaze down upon the valleys below and remember the moment her certainty shattered, and she would understand it as a gift rather than a wound. Long after her passing, songs would be sung not of her fire, but of her choice to listen. And in dragon memory, which does not fade as human memory does, the story would be told to every new brood, that once, when the world could have burned, the future was small and frightened and human, and the young chose him because he did not ask to be chosen. From that lesson grew a truth both races carried forward: that strength revealed through kindness does not weaken power, it defines it, and that even empires of flame may find their greatest legacy in the quiet courage of a child who simply held on when everything else demanded he run. The world that emerged after the Empress's passing did not fracture, as so many had feared, but steadied, as if an unseen hand had finally found the fulcrum it had been missing for ages, and at the center of that balance stood the memory of a choice made by children who had not yet learned to fear. The albino dragons matured into leaders unlike any before them, their authority unquestioned yet rarely enforced, because their presence carried the quiet certainty of those who had once been small and protected rather than commanded. Human cities near dragon lands transformed in response, walls lowering not in weakness but in trust, watchtowers becoming meeting halls, old warning bells repurposed to announce arrivals rather than attacks. Elian lived long enough to see this change take root, long enough to walk streets where dragon shadows passed overhead without panic, and when age finally bent his back and slowed his steps, he returned one last time to the mountain that had defined his life. He did not go as an emissary or legend, but as a man seeking closure, and the dragons received him not with ceremony but with familiarity, greeting him as one greets family long absent but never forgotten. The eldest of the albino dragons met him at the cavern's mouth, her silver eyes reflecting centuries of memory, and she lowered her head so he could rest a hand upon her brow, the same simple gesture that had begun everything. They spoke little because some truths no longer required words, and when Elian left the mountain for the final time, he did so knowing that his story no longer belonged to him alone. After his death, there was no monument raised of stone or gold, because both races understood that symbols too easily replaced meaning. Instead, a tradition formed, quiet and enduring. When a dragon hatchling took its first flight, it would be guided not toward dominance displays or trials of fire, but toward a place of shared warmth, a human hearth, a sheltered field, a space where choice could be felt rather than enforced. Humans, in turn, taught their children that fear was a teacher, not a ruler, and that respect did not mean submission. Conflicts did not vanish from the world. Neither species was so naive, but they changed shape, resolved more often through memory than blood. And in moments when old instincts surged, when fire threatened to answer insult and steel trembled with anticipation, Someone would remember a story passed down without embellishment. That once, the most powerful empress in the world had been shocked not by rebellion, but by love freely given, and that she had chosen to listen. That memory became a compass, subtle but unyielding, guiding both dragons and humans away from annihilation and toward coexistence. In the long view of history, scholars would argue endlessly about treaties, migrations, and economic shifts, but among dragons, whose memory did not fracture with time, the truth was simpler and never disputed, that the age of endless fire ended because the young were allowed to choose, and because one human child had been brave enough to stay still, to offer warmth without demand, and to trust that kindness could survive even in the heart of flame.